They said our town was timeless, but what they really meant was stuck. It took one new girl, a lightning strike in our quiet world, to finally shatter its complacent peace. Our town, Harmony Creek, is the kind of place that prides itself on being timeless, which is just a polite way of saying it's stuck. We have one stoplight, one diner, and a whole lot of people who think the height of culture is the annual Founders' Day picnic. So when Maya Washington and her family moved into the old Henderson house on Elm Street, it was like a spaceship had landed. For one, they were from Chicago. For another, they were black. In a town that was 99% white bread, Maya was a lightning strike. She walked into Harmony Creek High on the first day of junior year like she owned the place, not with arrogance but with a quiet confidence that baffled everyone. She didn't shrink under the constant stares or the whispers that followed her down the hall like a trail of breadcrumbs. She was brilliant in class, answering Mr. Abernathy's questions about constitutional law with a sharpness that left him blinking. And she was beautiful, with a style that made the rest of us in our faded jeans and hoodies look like we were still playing dress-up. Of course, this immediately put her on the radar of Chad Miller. Chad was our town's crown prince of mediocrity, a lumbering football player whose only two personality traits were his Letterman jacket and the fact that his dad was Officer Miller, the town's most aggressively bored cop. Chad saw Maya's confidence not as something to be admired, but as a challenge to his place at the top of our little food chain. He started small. Jokes in the hallway that weren't funny, tripping her by accident near the lockers. He and his goons would surround her, trying to intimidate her, but it was like trying to intimidate a statue. She'd just raise an eyebrow, give them a look that said, "Is that all you've got?" "Yes," and walk away, leaving them sputtering in her wake. I watched it all from a safe distance, a cocktail of admiration and cowardice swirling in my gut. I wanted to say something, to step in, but the fear of Chad, and more so his father, kept my mouth shut and my feet rooted to the floor. The whole thing came to a head on a Tuesday in the cafeteria. The air was thick with the smell of tater tots and simmering tension. Maya was sitting alone, as she often did, reading a book. Chad and his crew swaggered over to her table, blocking her in. "Hey, Chicago," Chad sneered, snatching the book out of her hands. "What you readin'? Something they don't teach in our simple country schools?" Maya didn't even flinch. She slowly looked up from where her book used to be, her gaze so calm and steady it was unnerving. "It's called The Fire Next Time. You should try it. You might need a dictionary, though." The cafeteria, which had been buzzing with low chatter, went dead silent. A couple of Chad's friends snickered, then caught themselves when they saw the rage flushing his face. He was used to people cowering, not firing back with surgical precision. "You think you're real smart, don't you?" he growled, puffing out his chest. "Smarter than someone who has to ask," she replied, her voice even. That's when he showed up. Officer Miller. He must have been doing his usual patrol of the school, which was really just an excuse to feel important and bully teenagers. He walked over, his boots thudding on the linoleum, a smug smirk plastered on his face. He put a heavy hand on his son's shoulder. "Everything all right here, son?" he asked, his eyes already locked on Maya. He wasn't asking his son. He was addressing her, daring her to say something was wrong. "Just teaching the new girl some manners, Dad," Chad said, his confidence surging now that his backup had arrived. Officer Miller's smirk widened. He looked down at Maya, then at the plastic cup of water on Chad's tray. He picked it up. "Well, let me help with the lesson," he said, his voice oozing a sick, paternalistic condescension. "Here in Harmony Creek, we believe in being neighborly, and sometimes folks from the big city, they get a little overheated, need to cool down." My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't happening. A cop wouldn't do this, not in the middle of a crowded cafeteria. But he did. With everyone watching, Officer Miller slowly and deliberately tilted the cup, pouring the entire stream of lukewarm water over Maya's head. It drenched her hair, ran down her face and soaked the front of her shirt. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. The water dripped from the ends of her braids onto the pages of her fallen book. Chad and his friends roared with laughter. Officer Miller stood there looking impossibly proud of himself, the empty plastic cup still in his hand. But Maya didn't cry. She didn't scream or curse. She sat there for a moment, the water dripping from her chin, a picture of absolute chilling stillness. Then, ever so slowly, she lifted her head, and the look in her eyes wiped the smirk right off Officer Miller's face. It wasn't fear or anger. It was something else, something cold and ancient, like watching a storm gather on a distant horizon. She rose to her feet, water dripping onto the floor, and looked him dead in the eye. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but carried across the silent room like a death sentence. "My father told me there would be men like you here," she said. "He also told me what happens to them." Officer Miller's face, which had been a mask of smug authority, seemed to short-circuit. The laughter from Chad's table died in their throats. For a beat, the only sound in the entire cafeteria was the drip, drip, drip of water from Maya's hair onto the linoleum floor. It was a bizarre, slow-motion moment where an entire room of people held their breath, waiting to see what would happen when an immovable object met an unstoppable force of ignorance. "Is that a threat?" Officer Miller finally managed to say, his voice a low rumble. He took a half-step closer, trying to use his size to intimidate her, a tactic that had probably worked on every other teenager in Harmony Creek. "It's a statement of fact," Maya said, her voice still impossibly calm. She didn't raise it. She didn't have to. The words themselves had enough weight to make the air feel thick and heavy. She hadn't broken eye contact with him for a second. This was a language Officer Miller didn't understand. He knew fear, he knew compliance, and he knew a cowering sort of respect. He didn't know this cold, unbreakable composure. It enraged him. The red flush that had started on his neck began creeping up past his jawline. "All right, that's it," he barked, his professionalism, if he ever had any, evaporating completely. "You're coming with me. We're going to have a little chat down at the station about disorderly conduct and disrespecting an officer." He reached out and grabbed her arm, his thick fingers wrapping around her bicep. I flinched as if I'd been the one he'd grabbed. This was it. This was the line. And he had just pole-vaulted over it. Suddenly a new voice cut through the tension. "Frank, what's going on here?" It was our principal, Mr. Henderson, a man whose spine was made of cooked spaghetti. He scurried over, wringing his hands, his face a mess of anxiety. "Police business, Henderson," Miller snapped, not even looking at him. He gave Maya's arm a rough tug. "This young lady needs to learn a lesson about authority." "But in the school? She's a student," Mr. Henderson stammered, looking helplessly from Miller's furious face to Maya's drenched but stoic one. "She's a public nuisance right now," Miller declared, puffing out his chest. "You want to file a complaint, you can come down to the station, after I'm done with her." The finality in his tone shut Mr. Henderson up completely. He just stood there, a useless scarecrow in a cheap suit. Miller started marching Maya towards the cafeteria exit, his grip on her arm like a vice. The students parted for them like the Red Sea, a sea of silent, terrified faces. Chad was grinning from ear to ear, looking like he'd just won the championship. I was frozen. My legs felt like they were bolted to the floor. My brain was screaming, "Do something! Record this! Yell!" But my body wouldn't obey. I was just another coward in the crowd. And then, just as they reached the double doors, Maya turned her head. Her eyes swept across the room, and for a split second, they met mine. There was no fear in them. There was no plea for help. It was something else entirely. It was a look that felt less like a request and more like a command. A silent, urgent message that said, "Witness this." That look broke the spell. As soon as the doors swung shut behind them, I was moving. I shoved my tray onto the nearest table, ignoring the clatter of silverware, and bolted for the side exit that led to the student parking lot. My heart was a wild drum against my ribs. I had no plan, no idea what I was going to do, but I knew I couldn't just sit there. I peered around the corner of the building, my breath catching in my throat. He wasn't taking her to the principal's office. He wasn't even taking her to the school's resource officer room. He was dragging her across the parking lot, straight towards his patrol car, parked brazenly in the red-painted fire lane. This wasn't about a lesson. This was something else, something dark and wrong. He yanked open the back door of the cruiser. "Get in," he ordered. Maya didn't struggle. She simply ducked her head and moved to get inside. But before she did, she stopped and said something to him. Her voice was too low for me to hear from across the lot, but I saw the words hit him. Officer Miller, who had been a swaggering giant of rage moments before, suddenly froze. He stared at her, his face going pale under his ruddy complexion. A flicker of something I'd never seen on him before. Genuine, unadulterated fear flashed in his eyes. It was gone as quickly as it came. He recovered, his anger returning to cover his panic. With a furious grunt, he shoved her the rest of the way into the back seat and slammed the door. The sound echoed in the quiet lot like a gunshot. He stormed around to the driver's side, threw himself in, and peeled out of the parking lot, tires squealing. I was left alone in the silence, watching the taillights disappear down Elm Street. The image of that cop's terrified face burned into my mind. What in the world did she say to him? The rest of the school day passed in a haze. The cafeteria incident became the stuff of instant legend, the story twisting and morphing with each telling. Some said Maya had pulled a knife. Others whispered she was part of a gang from Chicago. The truth, which was simply that she had refused to be broken, was far too simple and far too terrifying for most people to handle. I couldn't focus in any of my classes. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Officer Miller's face, that brief, unguarded moment of pure panic. It was like seeing a crack in a dam. You knew something immense and powerful was being held back, and you had no idea when it would burst. What did she say to him? The question looped in my brain, a maddening, unanswerable riddle. It had to be more than just a threat. It was something that had hit him on a personal level, a secret he thought was buried. I imagined her father wasn't just some guy from Chicago. The way she spoke about him, with such certainty, it was different. When the final bell rang, I didn't head for the bus. I walked home, taking the long way, which just so happened to pass by the Harmony Creek police station. It was a squat brick building that always looked vaguely sleepy, like the rest of the town, but today it felt different. It felt like the eye of a storm. Miller's patrol car was parked out front. There was no sign of Maya. I hovered across the street, pretending to look at my phone. My stomach twisted into a knot of anxiety. What was he doing to her in there? Was he yelling at her? Was he writing up some bogus report to ruin her record? An hour passed. The sun started to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The streetlights flickered on. Still nothing. Just as I was about to give up and head home, the front door of the station opened. My heart leaped into my throat. But it wasn't Officer Miller. It was Chief Brody, a man who mostly seemed to exist to cut ribbons at town events and drink coffee at the diner. He looked stressed, his face pale and sweaty even in the cool evening air. He got into his car and drove off, much faster than his usual leisurely pace. A few minutes later, another officer I didn't recognize left, looking just as rattled. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a cop bullying a teenager anymore. Something much bigger was happening inside that little brick building. Curiosity, stronger than my fear, pulled me closer. I crossed the street, my sneakers silent on the pavement, and crept up to the side of the building. There was a window, the blinds pulled down but not completely closed, leaving a thin crack of light. It looked into a small office. Holding my breath, I peered through the slit. And there they were. Maya was sitting in a chair, perfectly composed as if she were waiting for a bus. She wasn't in handcuffs. She wasn't crying. She looked bored. Across a metal desk from her was Officer Miller, and he was a complete wreck. His tie was loosened, his face was ashen, and he was pacing back and forth in the tiny room like a caged animal. He wasn't yelling. He was pleading. "Look, It was a joke," he was saying, his voice strained and high-pitched. "Just a stupid joke. My son, he's a kid. He does stupid things. I was just trying to teach you a lesson, that's all. A little respect." Maya didn't respond. She just watched him, her expression unreadable. "Your father," he stammered, running a hand through his already messy hair. "He doesn't have to get involved in this. This is a town matter, a misunderstanding. We can just forget the whole thing happened. I'll drive you home right now. I'll even apologize. To you, to your parents, to the whole school." The man who had stood like a colossus in the cafeteria dripping with arrogance as he poured water on her head, was now practically begging. He was terrified, not of Maya, but of the man she called her father. Who was her father? Maya finally spoke. Her voice was as clear and cold as ice water. "It's a little late for apologies, Officer Miller. You've already made several critical errors. The first was assuming I was alone. The second was touching me. The third—" She paused, letting the silence stretch until it was almost screaming. "Was thinking my father was someone who makes requests." Just then, the phone on Miller's desk rang, a shrill, piercing sound that made him jump a foot in the air. He stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. It rang again and again. Finally, with a trembling hand, he picked it up. "Miller," he choked out. He listened for a moment, and every last drop of color drained from his face. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. His eyes, wide with horror, darted to Maya. "Yes, sir," he whispered into the receiver. "Yes, I understand. Right away, sir." He hung up the phone, his hand shaking so badly he could barely place it back on the cradle. He looked at Maya, no longer as a cop to a troublemaker, but as a condemned man to his executioner. "He's here," Miller whispered, his voice cracking. "He's outside." Through the thin crack in the blinds, I saw Officer Miller practically collapse into his chair. He looked physically ill, his face a pasty, greenish-white under the fluorescent lights. The bravado, the arrogance, the casual cruelty he wielded like a weapon, it had all been stripped away, leaving behind a pathetic, terrified man. Maya, on the other hand, hadn't moved a muscle. She simply watched him, her expression a perfect mask of neutrality. She didn't look triumphant or smug. She looked like someone who was patiently waiting for the inevitable to happen. The front door of the police station opened with a quiet thump that sounded like a gavel in the tense silence. I flattened myself against the brick wall, my heart hammering. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, calm, measured, and heavy with purpose. They weren't the clunky, swaggering steps of a cop. These were different. The door to the office swung open. A man stood in the doorway, and even from my limited vantage point, his presence filled the entire frame. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit that made him look like he'd stepped out of a movie. He wasn't overtly muscular like Chad or Miller, but he radiated an aura of dense, coiled power. His head was shaved, his face was clean-shaven, and his eyes, as they swept the room, were like chips of obsidian. They landed on Officer Miller, who flinched and seemed to shrink even further into his chair. "Officer Miller," the man said. His voice was a deep, smooth baritone that held zero warmth. It was the voice of pure, unadulterated authority. "I am Special Agent Marcus Washington, Federal Bureau of Investigation." He held up a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming gold badge and an ID card. "I believe you have my daughter." My jaw almost hit the pavement. FBI. Maya's father was an FBI agent. The pieces clicked into place with dizzying speed. Her confidence, her refusal to be intimidated, her cryptic warning, it all made sense. She wasn't just some new girl from Chicago. She was the daughter of a man who hunted monsters for a living, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that her father was more dangerous than any small-town bully cop could ever hope to be. Agent Washington's gaze shifted to Maya. The coldness in his eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a profound, quiet concern. "Are you all right, Maya?" "I'm fine, Dad," she said, and for the first time, I heard a flicker of something other than icy composure in her voice. It was relief. "He put his hands on you," Agent Washington stated. It wasn't a question. His eyes swiveled back to Miller, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. "Officer Miller, you're going to hand over your badge and your service weapon. You are then going to give a full and complete statement regarding your assault on a minor, which was corroborated by over 100 witnesses at the high school. You will also be providing details on several other town matters that have recently come to my attention, including your department's creative interpretation of traffic fine collections and your son's extracurricular activities involving intimidation and extortion. Your career in law enforcement is over. What happens next depends entirely on your level of cooperation." Officer Miller looked like he was going to be sick. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was completely and utterly broken. The man who had terrorized our school, who had acted like a king in his little fiefdom, was nothing. He was just a pathetic bully who had finally picked on someone who could fight back, and the fight wasn't even fair. Agent Washington stepped aside. "Maya, let's go." She stood up, walked over to her father, and he placed a protective arm around her shoulders. As they turned to leave, Maya's eyes met mine through the window. For a split second, I saw her, not the untouchable force of nature, but a teenage girl who had been scared and humiliated. And in that look there was a flash of gratitude, a quiet acknowledgement that I had been there, that I had seen, that I had been a witness. They walked out of the station, leaving Miller to stew in the ruins of his life. I scrambled away from the window, my mind reeling. The next day at school, the news spread like wildfire. Officer Miller had been suspended indefinitely, pending an internal investigation. Chad Miller wasn't at school, and a rumor circulated that his family was packing up to move. The atmosphere was electric. The fear that had hung over the school like a permanent fog had lifted. People were talking, laughing louder. The space that Chad and his friends used to occupy by the lockers was empty, and no one rushed to fill it. It was as if the town itself could finally take a deep breath. At lunch, I saw Maya sitting at her usual table. This time, however, she wasn't alone. A couple of girls from my English class were sitting with her, talking and laughing. I watched for a moment, then, before my cowardice could stop me, I picked up my tray and walked over. "Is this seat taken?" I asked, my voice a little shaky. Maya looked up, and a small, genuine smile touched her lips. "No," she said, "it's not." I sat down. We didn't talk about what happened. We didn't need to. We talked about books and music and how terrible the cafeteria tete-a-tots were. And I realized that Harmony Creek wasn't stuck after all. It had just been waiting for a lightning strike to wake it up.